Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm Alec Holcomb, the director of Ohio University's Contemporary History Institute, the organization that sponsored this event. Like so many other positive things at Ohio University, this Baker Peace Conference was made possible by the generosity of the Baker family. That family became involved here in 1945 when a young Harvard professor named John Calhoun Baker was appointed university president. He arrived in Athens with his wife, Elizabeth, who had enjoyed a successful career in the performing arts. And John and Elizabeth were deeply affected by the catastrophic suffering that had accompanied the Second World War. And that suffering was brought home to the Bakers by the thousands of veterans, young veterans, who began to pour into the university after 1945. And John and Elizabeth, for the rest of their lives, would zealously promote the cause of peace in the world. And this annual peace conference is one manifestation of their belief in that cause. So few conflicts have generated more passionate and contentious discussion about the causes, nature, and legacies of war than the Vietnam War or the Second Indochina War, as I think most scholars prefer to call it. Since this April marks the 50th anniversary of that war's conclusion, we decided to make it the subject of this year's Baker Conference. However, we decided to explore a lesser-known part of the Vietnam War. This is the decade-long period following its end. What happened in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asian countries after the war ended? And in what ways did the war affect the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and the United States, the larger Cold War allies that were involved in the conflict? Tonight, we are excited to have as our keynote speaker Dr. Peter Zinoman. He's the son of a U.S. Foreign Service officer. He spent a large portion of his youth in Southeast Asia and has been visiting and studying the region, especially Vietnam, since at least 1986. Now in his 30th year as a member of the University of California at Berkeley History Department, Dr. Zinoman is the author of award-winning books on modern Vietnamese history, a founder of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, and the mentor to many influential scholars in the field of Southeast Asian studies. Tonight, he is going to take us into post-war Vietnam, primarily through the story of one of its most famous witnesses, the journalist, historian, and public intellectual Huy Duc. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Zinoman?
Thanks very much, Alec. And I want to thank the Contemporary History Institute for hosting me. A special thanks to Cameron Dunbar for doing all of the important logistical work to bring me here. A thanks to Cody Billock for picking me up at the airport and driving me here. And it should go without saying, a huge thanks to Alec Holcomb, one of my favorite students, one of those influential Southeast Asianists I trained, who he referenced in the introduction. It's really a thrill to come and to see him on his home turf. The decade of Vietnamese history that we are looking at in this conference, roughly 1975 to 1986, is known, I think, for two somewhat incongruous features. On the one hand, this period is notorious, as Alex Taiva and Dung Vu explained earlier in the afternoon, for its overall bleakness, a bleakness marked by half a dozen extremely grim developments. These include, and these have been mentioned earlier, and this is only a partial list, but some of you may have missed that session earlier today, so I just want to mention them. These grim developments include the abrupt exodus in several phases of over 1 million people from Vietnam, the extrajudicial punishment of people linked to the old Southern government, the Republic of Vietnam, or RVN, which included the jailing of hundreds of thousands of people, maybe up to 1 million, in so-called re-education camps, punitive economic measures against the Southern Vietnamese population, such as forced transfer to new economic zones, and catastrophic economic policies imposed throughout the country, leading to hyperinflation, mass poverty, and food insecurity. State-led pogroms against the resident Chinese population, the invasion and occupation of Cambodia by the Vietnamese army, and the extremely bloody and destructive border war with the People's Republic of China. While many of these items impacted the whole country, there's no question, again, as Alex Tai and Dung pointed out earlier today, that the people of southern Vietnam suffered the most by far during this decade. On the other hand, out of this decade, there emerges around 1986, 1987, the progressive liberalizing phenomenon known as renovation, or Doi Mới. The sequence of events here, I think, begs an obvious question. How was enlightened Doi Mới birthed from this dark period? Before addressing this question, I think it's important to note that Doi Mới can refer to several different things. On the one hand, it refers to an official policy of the Vietnamese Communist Party to move from a strict command economy to a, quote, socialist-oriented market economy that was issued formally at the Sixth Party Congress in 1986. Most scholarship on Doi Mới addresses this sort of economic dimension of the phenomenon, emphasizing the mix of local, regional, and global factors that shaped its birth and development over time. But Doi Mới also denotes a broader set of reformist initiatives that eased party control over many aspects of Vietnamese cultural, social, and political life. Its greatest impact, I think, was in the cultural realm, where an easing of censorship triggered a renaissance in Vietnamese literature, theater, painting, music, and film. Doi Mai's social impact was perhaps most deeply felt in education, which witnessed an unparalleled institutional expansion and structural liberalization of schools, especially at the post-secondary level. The consequences of Doi Mới in the political realm are, I think, a little more qualified, since the country remains today an authoritarian one-party state. However, Doi Mới did increase the level of autonomy and power enjoyed by the National Assembly, that's Vietnam's legislature. It encouraged legal reforms that opened slightly the political process and political process, and it permitted the domestic press to act as a meek but not entirely toothless watchdog over the workings of local, if not national, government. As with its narrow economic meaning, Doi Mới, in this broader sense, refers ultimately, I think, to a policy orientation of the Vietnamese Communist government. Hence, so-called progressives who pushed for liberalizing reforms in the cultural, social, and political spheres during the high Doi Mới era and afterwards should be seen, albeit with some exceptions, as followers of a new party mandate, not necessarily as independent, reformist trailblazers themselves. Finally, Doi Mới has one additional unofficial meaning as a genuinely progressive ethos present in enlightened quarters of the Vietnamese population starting in the mid to late 1980s. During an interview that I recorded in Hanoi in 1993, so this is 6 or 7 years after Doi Mới is first introduced, I asked the late, great humanist scholar Hoàng Ngọc Hiến how he understood Doi Mới. Hoàng Ngọc Hiến, as some of you will know, was the Vietnamese language translator of Vladimir Mayakovsky, the controversial Soviet poet who committed suicide in Moscow in 1930. In the late 1980s, Hoàng Ngọc Hiến helped found in Hanoi the Nguyễn Du School for Writers, the Trung Viet Văn Nguyễn Du, that produced such towering dissident and quasi-dissident Vietnamese authors as Bao Ninh and Dung Tu Hung, As a central figure in Doi Mui's dynamic literary sphere, Hwang Ao-kin's thoughts on the broader phenomenon are worth quoting at length. Hwang Ao-kin said, "Doi Mui means to replace what's old, but this change is a complicated process. At first, I had thought that it would only require people with good intentions banding together and knocking down the old ways in order for a new life to emerge. But it's not like that. Doi Mui is hard, and getting rid of the old is not as simple as knocking down a wall. This wall, in fact, may be invincible. It's certainly very formidable. As a result, change must occur first inside each person. One way to put it is there's an invisible wall inside each person. Inside me, there's a wall. Inside my daughter, there's a wall. And so the first change must occur internally. If not, you won't get real change or real progress. In other words, each person must first become a dissident against themselves because it's us whose mental habits need renovating." Later in that same interview, Hwang Ao-kin expanded further on this view, describing Doi Mui as a, quote, "new way of thinking or a new self-awareness marked by three values that were neglected during the war years: self-respect, self-confidence, and self-love." An understanding of the forces giving rise to the complex and transformative ethos or consciousness or self-awareness or style of thinking, I'm not exactly sure what to call it, that Hwang Ao-kin associated with Doi Mui requires different insights, I believe, than what's found in accounts of the birth of Doi Mui as a new government policy. In my talk today, I want to suggest that one possible source of such insights is the life and writing of the famous journalist, popular historian, and current political prisoner Chung Hui-san, known more widely by his pen name Hui Duk. For those of you who have never heard of Hui Duk or who only know him through recent headlines, let me provide some basic facts about his life. Hui Duk was born into a revolutionary family in 1962 and grew up on a collective farm in North Vietnam's Hat Binh province. When Vietnam and China went to war in February of 1979, 17-year-old Hui Duk volunteered for military service. He was sent to the Sino-Vietnamese border and saw action in an artillery unit for about 18 months. Between 1981 and 1983, Hui Duk attended an elite officer training school. It was during this period, in 1982, at the age of 20, that he joins the Vietnamese Communist Party. After graduating, Hui Duk spent part of 1983 and 1984 on a military base in Ho Chi Minh City studying the Khmer language. He then was posted to Cambodia from 1984 to 1987 as an advisor to the army of the Vietnamese-backed government there. In 1987, at the age of 25, Hui Duk left the army and took a job as a propaganda cadre with the district party office in Ho Chi Minh City. In December of 1988, he transitioned from this post to a job as a journalist at Thời Che newspaper. His journalistic career takes off at this point, and he becomes a well-known figure, writing for Ho Chi Minh City newspapers during the 2 decades between 1988 and 2009, essentially a 20-year-long journalistic career. But his writing, especially on corruption and on reform, runs afoul of party officials, and he's eventually kicked out of professional journalism. With this field close to him, Hui Duk starts to assemble material for a nonfiction book about Vietnam's post-war decade, the precise decade that we're looking at in this conference. In 2012, while on a Nieman Fellowship in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Hui Duk publishes this book overseas under the title The Winning Side. Banned in Vietnam, but available online, The Winning Side becomes a controversial blockbuster and underground bestseller. Since The Winning Side came out, Hui Duk has lived in Ho Chi Minh City, where he writes about current events on his Facebook page and runs 2 extremely small NGOs. Last June, so this is June 2004, Hui Duk was arrested and charged with posting subversive content on Facebook, and he remains today in pretrial detention outside of Hanoi. While Hui Duk is best known today, I think, as Vietnam's most high-profile political prisoner. He has been closely associated since the late 1980s with the more expansive understanding of Doi Moi described by Hwang Ao-kin in my 1993 interview. Because of his revolutionary family background, his military service, and his Communist Party membership, Huy Duk's reformism illustrates dynamics involved in both the rejection of an old Vietnamese political project and the adoption of a new one. What's interesting, I think, and to the extent that my talk today has a thesis, this is it, but it's not a very robust thesis, but this is pretty much what the thesis is. What's interesting, I think, is that the seeds of Huy Duk's political transformation were planted in quintessentially communist spaces, the collective farm, the army, and post-war Saigon under Northern occupation. And this, I think, is a little bit of a contrast maybe to Dung's answer to the last question about the origins of Doi Moi. Yes, Lê Duẩn, Chung Ching, things happen at the top of society, but also something happens within society at the bottom that I think helps to generate this other kind of Doi Moi, this, I think, more fundamental and maybe more important kind of Doi Moi. I should say that my understanding of Huy Duk derives from a decade-long friendship that we share, and from a long interview with him that I recorded in 2013 when he visited California after completing his Nieman Fellowship. This long interview will provide much of the source material for the remainder of my talk. As with Nguyen Huy Thiep for literature, or maybe Tran Van Thuy for film, Huy Duk is a kind of emblem of Doi Moi journalism. His byline first appears in December 1988 in the Toi Che newspaper, edited at the time by Vu Kim Hein, a great champion of journalistic freedom in the Doi Moi era. Kim Hein was famously sacked in 1991 after a series of controversial editorial decisions that she made. Huy Duk's first beat for the paper included the surprisingly lively field of legal reform. An entire system of laws that remains in force in Vietnam today was crafted during that time, he explained to me during this 2013 interview. I was lucky to interview lawmakers, listen to their ideas, and follow their debates in the newly energized National Assembly. I wrote hundreds of articles contributing ideas for drafting the Constitution, the land law, the penal code, and the civil code. I learned a lot through direct observation of the political and legislative process. To understand the courts, I attended hundreds of trials, big and small, all throughout the country. Connected to his writing on law was his coverage during this period of corruption. Army connections from his years as a uniformed soldier facilitated access to sources of information about military graft. One case in Ho Chi Minh City involved black marketeering and Cambodian pornography screened on a local army base. He also helped break big financial scandals, such as the Thanh Hung Perfume Company case and the Dung Sun Quan case involving police links to commercial sex work in a Ho Chi Minh City suburb. Huy Duk's reputation as a lion of Doi Moi journalism was deepened by his coverage of the National Assembly. In those days, the National Assembly met regularly to debate how it should be described in the upcoming 1992 Constitution, he explained to me. I was among a small group of journalists who favored a more professionalized National Assembly in which members worked full-time instead of part-time as in the past. Some of my articles were passionate, and they were criticized for their, quote, deviant political views. I received many threatening letters from the Ministry of Culture and Information, from the City Central Propaganda and Training Committee, and from the local party office. They depicted me as politically problematic, someone to keep an eye on. In 1992, the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City instructed Toi Che newspaper not to let me cover sensitive topics anymore. Threats of prosecution followed in response to my controversial article, Voters Continue to Hope for a Renovated National Assembly. That was the name of the article. I was nearly prosecuted under Article 205 of the old Penal Code for abusing my rights of freedom and democracy to infringe upon the interests of the state. I was lucky to dodge a bullet at that time. Huy Duk's career as an investigative journalist peaks, I think, with his 2008 article in the newspaper Saigon Tip T entitled Big Sister of the Prime Minister. It exposed a lucrative sweetheart business deal of Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dutham's oldest sister. The article, as you might imagine, infuriated the Prime Minister, and Vietnamese security police intensified their harassment of Huy Duc. The police set up a surveillance station outside of my office, he explained. 2 security agents would sit all day outside my workspace. Their only task was to observe when I arrived, when I left, and which direction I headed. Other agents followed me. I had not violated any law, but the daily presence of security agents placed a lot of pressure on the other journalists at the paper, even those who were sympathetic to me. I felt bad and thought about leaving the paper. This level of surveillance lasted 17 stressful months. My blog post, The Berlin Wall, was perhaps the final straw. Saigon Tip T and I agreed to part ways, and my career as an official journalist ended in August of 2009. Reflecting on his journalistic career years later, Huy Duc underlined the significance of the Doi Moi era in shaping his experience. The period during which I worked in the press was amongst the most open in recent history, he said. Had I become a journalist prior to Doi Moi, I would have only written articles that praised the party and the state. I'm not going to boast that had I been a different kind of journalist, I'm not going to boast that I would have been a different kind of journalist. I was just lucky. But once my eyes were opened, I could not return to the old journalism. I could not become a journalist who simply showers praise on the government. I could not become a journalism who writes things I do not believe. My journalistic career began in a different era. After being forced out of institutional journalism, Huy Duc turns his attention to curating an independent blog that he names Ocean, a Vietnamese slang term for household servant. Huy Duc discovered blogging while on a year-long fellowship at the University of Maryland in 2006. When I was in the United States on a Humphrey Fellowship, he explained, I attended a conference at Columbia University where I met an Indian researcher who talked about the future of citizen journalism. I was struck by its importance and decided to use it as a vehicle for my writing. I published at least 1 post a week, which drew hundreds of thousands of hits daily. Some posts received more than 1,000 comments. I eventually restricted the comment section because there were too many to vet. Police continued to keep me under close surveillance. I had a nagging feeling during this time that I was being set up by the police, but I somehow managed to stay out of jail. In February 2010, my blog, my Facebook page, and my Gmail account were all hacked simultaneously, and I lost access to all 3. With his Ocean blog shut down, Huy Duc started writing the massive 2-volume, 900-page book, The Winning Side. Based on material collected during his years as a working journalist, The Winning Side provides a thoroughly researched, deeply revisionist history of Vietnam's post-war decade, centering in its narrative the history of official retribution against South Vietnam by the victorious North. The book matter-of-factly assumes the existence of winning and losing Vietnamese sides, an interpretation of the conflict as a civil war that contradicts an official narrative in which Vietnam defeated American imperialism along with its local puppets. The many harsh and vengeful forms of retribution depicted in the book include the re-education camp system, campaigns against the southern bourgeoisie, the expulsion of the Chinese, the invasion of Cambodia, the exodus of the boat people, and the catastrophic communization of the southern economy. Callous, corrupt, and deeply dishonest, agents of the victorious communist government are shown encouraging children to denounce their parents for political crimes and extorting money from traumatized family members of re-education camp prisoners. Measures employed to repress the residues of a decadent imperial culture in the South include book burnings, the banning of reactionary authors, the draconian policing of fashion and hairstyles, and the imposition of a strict regime of censorship over the arts. Departing from strict norms surrounding representations of Ho Chi Minh, still tightly policed in the country today, The Winning Side implicates the communist leader in some of the party's worst mistakes, such as the violent land reform of 53 to 56, the rushed socialization of the northern economy after 1954, and the suppression of the anti-Stalinist Nhân Giải Phóng movement from 1958 to 1960 and beyond. The book narrates the rise of Doi Moi in the late 1980s, but it concludes with the weakening of the political part of the reformist agenda under pressure from conservative forces. Huy Duc's low estimation of anti-democratic strongmen in the party and the state, such as Lê Khả Phiêu and Nguyen Thanh Dũng, adds a pessimistic note to the final chapters. As he concludes the narrative, Vietnam's reforms remain mired in the authoritarian politics of a single-party state. The Winning Side was banned in Vietnam as soon as it came out, but it has been widely accessed online amongst Vietnamese readers, both inside and outside the country. It generated a massive critical discourse, with government newspapers uniformly denouncing it, but readers and overseas critics showering it with fulsome praise. Harvard historian Huey Tham Ho Tai told the BBC that, quote, "No writing on the post-war South can ignore Huy Duc's book." One Southern reader inside the country, Vu Thi Phung Anh, expressed disbelief that all the misery that she had suffered in the South after the war had been thoroughly described by a member of the winning side. Indeed, because of the book, the winning side remains a common slang in Vietnam today for the Hanoi regime, a clear sign of its impact on the broader political culture. While different aspects of the post-war punishment of the South has been recounted in memoirs published overseas and written from the subjective point of view of ex-RVN citizens, The Winning Side stands out, I think, as a fairly objective account, thoroughly researched and written by a Northerner. Its reliance on interviews with high communist officials, such as Vo Van Kiet, who was close to Huy Duc before he passed away, allows it to explore the messy decision-making processes behind the North's vindictive policy towards its defeated enemies. Finally, it should be noted that The Winning Side is beautifully written. It describes high politics with a lively and dramatic narrative prose style, comparable, I would argue, to a Bob Woodward book. Like Woodward's, Huy Duc's writing holds the powerful to account in a clear, readable language accessible to a wide audience. Because of this, Huy Duc's writing has the capacity both to attract a big readership and to shape significantly public opinion. Although the risk of persecution in the wake of the appearance of The Winning Side was high, Huy Duc returned to Vietnam in 2013 and somehow managed to stay out of jail. But his days as a journalist or a publishable author were over. With limited options, Huy Duc has spent the following decade, from 2013 up until this past summer, curating an active Facebook page where he posts in a careful, I would say, non-confrontational manner in general about politics and current events. He also founded, as I mentioned, 2 small NGOs focused on deforestation, veterans issues, and post-war reconciliation. This past summer, on June 1st, 2024, the Ho Chi Minh City-based Facebooker Lê Nguyễn Hung Cha broke the news that Huy Duc had been arrested. Saturday morning at 9 a.m., authorities invited journalist Huy Duc to work with them, she wrote on her timeline. He returned this evening while they searched his home, and then he was taken away again. No official announcement followed Lê Nguyễn Hung Cha's report, but Huy Duc's Facebook page vanished the next day, and he remained suspiciously absent from all social media platforms. 6 days later, on June 7th, police officials confirmed the arrest through a brief notice in state media. It reported that Huy Duc had been detained and would be held for 3 months under Article 331, a controversial law that prohibits abusing rights of freedom and democracy to infringe upon the interests of the state. It's an old law now renovated in the 21st century. This notice failed to explain how precisely Huy Duc had violated Article 331, but global human rights groups quickly pointed out that Vietnamese authorities frequently deploy this overly broad statute when prosecuting peaceful critics of the government. In early February, so just a couple of weeks ago, a formal indictment was announced that referenced 13 unspecified Facebook posts as the reason for Huy Duc's arrest. As I said, Huiduk's pretrial detention continues up to the present day. There's unconfirmed reports that he may stand trial as soon as the end of the month and that he could receive a jail sentence of up to 7 years. While the offending Facebook posts have yet to be identified, many speculate that they include criticisms that he published in the early summer of 2024 about the growing political power of the Vietnamese police within the domestic political realm. A risky move throughout the communist era, such anti-police rhetoric has recently become even more dangerous owing to the rapid political rise within the governing Politburo of strongman Tolam, a former head of the Ministry of Public Security. Huiduk's earlier brushes with the authorities during his journalistic career and in the wake of the winning side raise the likelihood that his recent arrest is connected not just to offending Tolam, but to a longer history of transgressions that date to the early Doi Moi era of the late 1980s. Having established, I hope, Huiduk's bona fides as a spokesman and as a symbol of Doi Moi, I want to conclude with some speculative discussion about the origins of his progressive political commitments. These commitments, as I've tried to show, include common items in the Doi Moi agenda: economic reform, government transparency, the rule of law, freedom of the press, and democracy promotion, and one, I think, fairly unusual concern: opposition to the punishment of South Vietnam by the post-war Vietnamese government. As suggested above, these commitments are remarkable because of their durability over time and because Huiduk's early life was spent in socially privileged, politically orthodox communist spaces: the Collective Farm, the Army, the Communist Party, and Ho Chi Minh City under post-war Northern occupation. In my interview with him in 2013, he described how his experiences in these spaces contributed decisively to his political evolution towards liberal reformism. First, Huiduk emphasized the significance of growing up on the Tak Ngalp Collective Farm, a place that was widely seen, or at least that he described, as a kind of socialist Potemkin village. Huiduk's family could join this collective farm because his parents belonged to a privileged social caste, poor peasants who had joined the revolution in 1945. While he loved his father, Huiduk described him as a communist true believer who wrote cadre poetry in his free time that praised the party, the government, and Chairman Ho. Although his material life on the farm was pitifully impoverished, in fact, he grew up with no indoor plumbing or electricity, Huiduk recognized that the children of collective farm families received higher than normal government rations of ripe meat and cloth. They also enjoyed better than average schools because, as he put it, the government wanted to cast socialism in the most positive possible light. While rations in schools were better than the norm, Huiduk described the atmosphere on the collective farm as tightly circumscribed by the communist state. There was no library, few books, and nothing available published before 1954 when the communists took power. Cultural offerings were parochial, although residents had some access to literature and films from China and the Soviet Union. Domestic and global news came primarily via loudspeaker. The Vietnamese propaganda system was very sophisticated, he told me. Cadres would speak directly to us, providing information beyond what appeared in our press. Before joining the Army in 1978, I naively placed absolute trust in state media. I believed almost 100% of what it reported, both about China and about the building of socialism in the North. Our propaganda system was at its peak in those days. Newspapers praised the fact that a new cooperative provided modern showers to its members. You must understand that for a country boy like me who bathed daily in a stream, a shower faucet sounded ultra-modern. This kind of propaganda fed our belief in socialism, the state, and the Communist Party. Huiduk also pointed out that state control encouraged in him delusional thoughts about the South, comparing it to North Korean conquest fantasies about South Korea. There was something burning inside of me those days, he explained. At school in the North, we learned about the misery and suffering of the South. After April 30th, 1975, I felt that I must go south and educate the young people there to help them to overcome their misery and to teach them to be good people. I believe that they had been brainwashed by the schools of the Americans and their puppets. I wonder if North Korean youth today dream of liberating and educating the youth in South Korea in the way that I did in those days. I felt that this passionate ambition of mine was a beautiful thing. Huy Duk's most critical remarks about Tak Ngok Farm, however, concerned its economic inefficiency. The collective farm provided my first understanding of socialist economics, he explained. We heard that the lemongrass oil produced on our farm was exported to the Soviet Union, but we never knew its medicinal benefit or economic value. We only knew that workers who produced it received a stable salary, and its size followed a fixed scale. Whatever quality of work you did, you earned the same salary. Looking back, I realized that workers on the collective farm could grow and harvest whatever they liked, but no matter how much they harvested, they received the same amount of work credit. To earn a full salary, just show up for work 26 days per year, 26 days per month. You could just hang out in the fields and you would still receive the same salary. I recall that when workers on the farm were idle, cadres like my father had to invent make work to keep them busy. For example, my father would make them cut enough grass in one day to make bales of hay, to make bales that measured 1 cubic meter. But though the bales had clean corners, they were completely empty inside. This didn't matter so long as they appeared on the outside to form 1 cubic meter. And once we made the bales, we had no idea what to do with them. They were strewn around the farm. But this mate work was necessary for workers to log their 26 working days per month and earn their salaries. The fate of this collective farm was tied to the government. After it stopped receiving state subsidies, it disbanded itself immediately because it was impossible to make an honest living working in this way. While raising doubts about Vietnamese communism's economic foundations, the collective farm also made Huy Duk appreciate Vietnam's many regional identities. One lucky thing about living on the collective farm, he told me, was that its members came from all over the country. And so I came to recognize that my accent was a little different from others, or even from a pure Ha Tinh provincial accent. There were southern regroupees from Quang Nam and Quang Ngai, and folks who had migrated from Hanoi or Lai Châu or Son La. People from all over lived on the farm, and they spoke Vietnamese in very different ways. Folks from different regions brought with them their own book collections, and I borrowed lots of books from people like this. Sympathy for the South displayed in the winning side might be related in some sense to a kind of sensitivity towards regional diversity that Huy Duk first felt while growing up on this collective farm. Like the collective farm, the Army also shaped Huy Duk's consciousness in multiple ways. It confirmed for Huy Duk the regional complexity underpinning Vietnam's national unity and provided him exposure to the culture of the South. The time I spent at officer training school played a crucial role in my subsequent development, he explained to me. Like the collective farm, the officer training school attracted young people from different places, different battlefields in this case. Some came from the Cambodian theater. Others had fought before 1975, and some, like me, arrived from the northern border. These soldiers possessed many talents. Some could play musical instruments, others could really sing, and some wrote fiction and poetry. In general, officer training schools received the best soldiers from different units. Among them was Truong Ngoc Phom, who became a dear friend. It was during this time that I came to know the songs of Trịnh Công Sơn, who happened to be a friend of Truong Ngoc Phom's father. I was also exposed to many songs written for soldiers from the Republic of Vietnam, such as A Rainy Afternoon on the Border, Chiều Mưa Biển Rơi. In addition, the Army provided Huy Duk with a useful vantage point from which to observe the country's mounting economic and political crises. When I volunteered for the Army, I wanted to defend my country, he explained. But these were years when public trust in the regime hit rock bottom. Soldiers suffered greatly. Many gave their lives fighting at the northern border and in Cambodia. Meanwhile, politicians and military generals squabbled with one another. Factions multiplied and corruption grew. Corruption was especially bad among high-ranking military officials, and the Army's public reputation plummeted. Before I joined the Army, my view of the world came from school and state newspapers, but these views began to change in the Army. especially during the 3 years I spent in officer training school. It was then that my faith in the regime slipped away. Conditions were so poor that soldiers went hungry. Of course, hunger was not the only thing that changed my frame of mind, but I do believe that it made me more objective about the state of the country. I no longer saw the party, the state, and President Ho Chi Minh as idols as I had when I was a student. Finally, Huy Duc was sent to Ho Chi Minh City by the military in 1983, and it was here that he became exposed to the more cosmopolitan intellectual culture of the South. Through friends in the Army whose families lived in Ho Chi Minh City, he gained access to private libraries and was amazed by the range of texts available in the South, including thousands of Western books in Vietnamese translation. I started reading many books from the pre-1975 regime, he recalled, including works of Western political science. I came to grasp concepts such as the separation of powers, an independent legislature, and impartial law enforcement. In addition to accessing Southern intellectual culture, Huy Duc was able to observe the tragic fate of Southerners persecuted by the communist regime. In 1983 and 84, I was posted to Saigon, he recalled, and many ex-RVN people were returning home from re-education camp at that time. This left a big impression on me. At virtually every intersection in Saigon in those days, you would see a group of cyclo drivers and informal motorcycle taxis. There were many more of them than customers, something like 3 to 4 drivers per passenger. Perhaps because supply exceeded demand by so much, underemployed drivers could be seen reading books while waiting for business. Some read books in English, some read books in French, some read thick tomes like the Brothers Karamazov, and many other books that I had never heard of before. I began speaking with them, and this is when I started to learn about the Saigon intelligentsia, as well as former officers from the old regime. Having just returned from re-education camp, most of these poor guys had no idea about their futures. My talk today has suggested that the unusual breadth and intensity of Huy Duc's reformist commitments exemplify Hoàng Ngọc Hien's understanding of Doi Moi as a form of passionate, progressive idealism, perhaps a kind of new consciousness. As few scholars have studied this particular version of Doi Moi, its origin and development, I think, remain poorly understood. While Vietnamese Doi Moi may have been facilitated by changes in the global communist world or changes at the top of the political food chain within the country itself, Huy Duc's story confirms, I think, that it was also shaped fundamentally by the dynamics of Vietnamese communist institutions and local social life at the local level. But while Huy Duc's embrace of Doi Moi, or at least of this particular version of Doi Moi, was shaped by local conditions, the remarkable courage that he has displayed resisting state despotism does not necessarily lend itself to deterministic academic explanations. Indeed, how to explain his courageous and sadly prophetic final answer in our 2013 interview? He said, "I recently told a friend that no free man would ever choose prison, but in some cases, to defend a right to freedom, prison cannot be avoided. If everybody avoids prison, we will never achieve freedom." Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for some questions for Dr. Zinoman. Maybe I'll start off.
Sure.
In your talk, Facebook, social media comes up a lot. What does Facebook mean in Vietnam?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hugely important. Vietnam never introduced the controls over Facebook that the Chinese Communist regime did, right? China set up its own alternative to Facebook. But Vietnam, for whatever reason, decided that it would tolerate normal Facebook. And so as the regime has shut down public discourse in all sorts of other arenas and venues, Facebook has emerged as the closest thing that Vietnam has to a kind of open public square. Now, it's not totally open. It is beset by troll farms, government-run troll farms that distort the comment sections of people's Facebook pages and provide lots of one-sided comments to controversial posts. And people like Huy Duc periodically get targeted for what they write on Facebook, arrested, tried, and jailed. But the number of people writing politically provocative things on Facebook is way bigger than the number of people who are being targeted. It's almost like the regime has decided that something like it's going to arrest someone for doing something it doesn't like on Facebook once a month to sort of send a message that this can happen, and that if you think that this is a completely free public space, it's not. And so I think that this policing of Facebook, this kind of weird permission to allow it to occur, but selective targeting of people who get out of line on Facebook, it has a weird effect. It sort of chills, to some extent, the most provocative kinds of political expression on Facebook. But, people feel fairly confident liking things, provocative things, in the comment section, or writing in the comment section, actually, additional points. Yeah, I agree with you, good point. To the extent that there is a movement in the country in support of Huy Duc, now in jail, a movement calling for him to be released, a movement sort of mourning what's happened to him, that's happening on Facebook. And people, they feel fairly, they feel secure, or they feel unusually brave. They call them keyboard heroes. They feel safe behind Facebook. And so, Huy Duc has been under house arrest now for 8 months. On the 3-month anniversary, a lot of Facebook pages, people will post his picture as their, their icon, their homepage. And those people are not all picked up and arrested. But, will people write a status saying the arrest of Huy Duc is a terrible crime and he's got to be released? Some people will, but it's much more limited than I think it would be if there wasn't this kind of weird, periodic policing of Facebook. So Facebook is an extremely important, extremely fascinating space for political speech. I think clearly, Dung could maybe, I don't know if he agrees, but the most important space for political discourse in the country. Yeah, would you say that's true? Yeah, which I don't think is the case in China, but it is the case in some other repressive authoritarian states.
Hi, just jumping off that a little bit.
Yeah.
Are there any other social media apps that are fairly popular in Vietnam, such as Instagram or Twitter?
I know that Twitter is not.
Okay.
I'm too old to know if Instagram is, or TikTok. But some younger person could maybe say. But I do know that Facebook towers above everything else. It's really quite remarkable how important Facebook is, how ubiquitous it is. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the percentage of the population on Facebook in Vietnam is really incredible. And of course, it's not only used for political speech. People are using it for all the normal things that people use Facebook for. But the political Facebook in Vietnam is really a kind of remarkable and singular kind of thing. I follow a bunch of these kind of people on Facebook, and I've tried to follow them on Twitter, but on Twitter, it's just, I don't know why it hasn't caught on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Yeah. Since I'm a Laos person, so there was a book a couple years ago by Holly Hai, who called Project Land, and she makes so some people in Laos studies have been referring to the government in Laos as being post-socialist. I don't agree with that, and Holly High didn't agree with it either. And one of the argument that she made in her book was that people have overemphasized the economic reform aspect of it and haven't realized that really socialism in these in Laos was really more of a social or cultural project, and that really hasn't been reformed in the same way that economics have been reformed, and that therefore we should not be referring to Laos as a post-socialist country at all, and that this is an inappropriate term, and it sort of overemphasizes the economics. So I'm wondering if people in Vietnamese studies who I'm less familiar with are saying similar things. Or it sounds like in some ways you're saying the same thing, but you didn't really elaborate. You sort of started off at the beginning of your talk sort of talking about that, but then you turned to the very interesting story of Huy Duc. So I'm just wondering what you think about this idea of post-socialism as more of a cultural phenomenon than simply an economic one.
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, I would definitely disaggregate socialism into these different spheres. And in the economic sphere, yeah, I mean, the changes since '87 are profound. I started working in Vietnam in 1989, it's the first time I visited. And, you know, I mean, if you go there today, it's completely unrecognizable, right? The level of commerce, the level of urban development. I mean, people in the late '80s were short and skinny. I mean, the malnourishment was there, visible, very, very obvious. And now, you know, it's been 30 years of basically boom economy because of these economic reforms. Now, whether those I'm still on the economic side, you know, how to characterize those reforms, I think, is an interesting question. You know, is this kind of sort of mafia capitalism where the people who are connected to the state have certain advantages and protections, and they're the ones who really prosper in this new economy? I think there's interesting evidence for that. But there's no question that just calling the economy socialist in the style of the collective farm that Huy Duc grew up on, that's over. But these other realms, I think, are really, really significant. And you mentioned the political realm or the cultural realm. I would actually start with the aesthetic realm. So if you just travel around big Vietnamese cities, there's hammer and sickles. There's, I mean, it's starting to erode. But when I first, when I was working there in the 90s, there were portraits of Stalin and Lenin in the post office. If you looked at the cover of newspapers on Stalin's death anniversary or birthday, there'd be a big portrait of Stalin. And a kind of, you could say, well, it was a pro forma kind of celebration of him. But nevertheless, it's sort of ubiquitous, hammer and sickles, red stars, this old Soviet iconography. The Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum is still the top tourist site. I read recently that Hanoi has one of the last Lenin statues. It's a huge Lenin statue in a very central place near Ba Ding Square. The biggest and most beautiful park in Hanoi is Lenin Park, although has that been renamed? I'm not sure if it was. It's now Reunification Park, but it was Lenin Park up until very recently. So all of that stuff, the sort of we're part of this big socialist world, and there's a certain style, a certain aesthetic style. That has, I mean, the rate that that's eroded versus the economic changes is like night and day. And then, there's the more concrete character of the political system. Again, I would defer to political scientists like Dung to talk about what that system is like. But what strikes me about it is it's a single-party system. There's not even the most remote consideration of a second party. The media, right? Like, the media is interesting. Like, when I first went to Vietnam, there's just a handful of newspapers all saying the same thing. Then there's this rapid expansion of media, but they're still all saying the same thing. It's just now you go to a newsstand, there's 50 newspapers saying the same thing instead of 10. So I don't see that as a fundamental an important kind of change. And just, I don't know, just to give one other example, this I may be just picking out random things, but like Ho Chi Minh as an emblem of the regime. You know, one reason that people on Facebook get arrested is for criticizing Ho Chi Minh. One reason that people get in trouble outside of Facebook is saying bad things about Ho Chi Minh. People in Thai studies are constantly banging on about how the lèse-majesté laws in Thailand are so horrible and you can't do any of this stuff about the king. Ho Chi Minh has been dead for a long time, 60 years, right, 55 years, and yet his treatment is actually very, very similar, totally hands-off. And think about the message that that gives to people, that you can't do anything but kind of worship him. Is that communism or socialism? I don't know, but it's definitely great leader authoritarianism / totalitarianism.
I'll just end by saying that sounds almost exactly the same as present-day Laos.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
To what extent would you say some of the reforms that you have discussed are coming top-down as opposed to bottom-up? Is it more so like the leadership changing is more so what's driving them mild increase in permissiveness, or would you say it is more so the leadership responding to the people? Because no matter how authoritarian a regime is, they still need to placate the masses to some extent, otherwise they're still going to lose enough support among the people that eventually they hit critical mass and things kind of boil over.
Right. I mean, it's a little bit of a false choice between top-down and bottom-up. You know, a lot, I think, of the most well-respected scholarship on Doi Moi by people like Ben Kirkfleet or Adam Ford, they're sort of committed to this vision of bottom-up. And they say, you know, again, some similar things that Dung had said earlier about farmers fleeing cooperatives in the 1980s, and they point to, you know, experiments with markets that are introduced at the local level that predate the 86 policy change. And Huy Duc actually writes a bit about the sort of economic side of Doi Moi, and he confirms this, that, you know, people are hungry, and these productive systems in the late 70s and early 80s are just crazily ineffective, inefficient. And so, you know, experimentation is going on, sometimes clandestinely, sometimes with the support of sort of local officials, but not higher officials. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that all that stuff is going on in the late 70s and early 80s and sort of predates the change. But I don't disagree with Dung's point that the death of Lê Duan, you know, maybe the rise of Nguyen Van Linh, the personality of political leaders matters, and there's a period during the Doi Moi, high Doi Moi era where, you know, you've got people like Vo Van Kiet who are more progressive, liberal types. Nguyen Ca Tac may be the old foreign minister, and that's not insignificant. So I don't think it has to be one or the other. It's some kind of confluence of the two, I think.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Great talk, Peter. And really, I was just in Vietnam last month, so the yellow star flags and the sickle and hammer were out in full force because it was the anniversary of something or another. It's not necessarily a question, but during that visit, we had a Vietnamese tour guide who told his version of how it all happened, how Doi Moi happened, and in his telling, it has to do with I guess a party leader, some ideologue, buying a can of Coke that he notices is made in Thailand, and realizing that why aren't we able to do this in Vietnam? I don't know, it's perhaps apocryphal, but that's how at least somebody born and raised in Vietnam believes the reforms happened. Thoughts?
Apocryphal.
Okay.
Sounds apocryphal to me. But I've actually gone on a bunch of tours. Like, I've been the guest lecturer on guided tours, and so I had to listen to the local tour guides. And yeah, that's the kind of stuff they make up.
Interesting.
And
Yeah, so I
tell
just
people.
asked
But there's-
ChatGPT.
Yeah, I don't think
confirm
there's
this.
this. I don't think
And,
Thai Coke is the answer. But there is. I mean, I actually think this history has not been fully written, and there's delegations of Vietnamese who are going abroad and observing things, and it's a very big and complicated story. There's got to be a lot of different dynamics and actors involved in it. So I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, I fed it to ChatGPT, of course, and it said it's apocryphal.
Yeah.
Story goes that Trung Trinh, Vietnam's top ideologue and hardline communist, had an eye-opening experience when he traveled abroad in the 1980s.
That's actually interesting because, so Chung Cheng, again, one of the guys that Dung mentions, an old line party guy. His name literally translates to Long March, right? Seen as a Maoist, a member of the Maoist wing of the party, and seen as, during the pre-Doi Moi era as sort of part of the problem, a conservative like To Hieu, the poet who causes the big inflation in the 1980s. Huy Duc actually tells a very long, elaborate story about Chung Cheng, not necessarily going abroad, but going south, and going into the south and witnessing some of these experiments, and also recognizing that people are hungry. There's this kind of broad hunger, and something's going wrong. And Chung Cheng, I don't know if other people agree with me, but he emerges as a kind of weird hero of the winning side, more so than Nguyen Van Linh, who, in a lot of typical American journalistic accounts, like Neil Sheehan goes back to Vietnam in the early 90s and sort of tells the story of Doi Moi, and he says, Nguyen Van Linh, the new general secretary in '86, he's the guy. But Huy Duc says, actually, Nguyen Van Linh is responsible for the short-circuiting of the reforms. He was actually a much more conservative figure in Huy Duc's telling. I confess, I don't really know. But it's just interesting that he really credits Chung Cheng as having a change of heart in his late 70s, early 80s. It's kind of an interesting story if it's true.
Thank you.
Hey, Peter.
Hey, Cody.
Thanks for your talk. Great. So I was very interested in your kind of description of Huy Duc's self-renovation and this process. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the differences between continuity between like older reformist movements within the Communist Party, communist spaces, like under scholarship with Nhan Van Thai Pham.
With like scholarship what?
With their scholarship on Nhan Van Thai Pham.
Okay.
And like Soviet kind of reformist movements. Do you see Huy Duc's reformism as part of a broader continuity with that? Or is it more of a clean break with renovation in 1986? So
Yeah,
it's a false choice.
That's a good historian's question. Is there continuity or change with Huy Duc's brand of reformism and some of these earlier brands? And you referenced the Nhan Van Thai Pham, famous reformist movement of 1956, really 1956, 57, 58. That's like before Doi Moi, the great reform movement in communist Vietnam coincides with de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union and Khrushchev and that whole series of movements and initiatives throughout the communist world that eventually leads to uprisings in Hungary and Poland. And so that is a movement that is a global movement. Vietnam has its own version of that in the 50s. And some folks would say prior to Doi Moi, that's the biggest and most important communist era reform. Does that reform and this reform, or those two reforms, are they more marked by continuity or by change. Sorry to be so long-winded in reformulating your question. My answer is change. Because if you look at those guys in the 50s, the Khrushchev-era guys, they're basically, well, they share something with Huiduk in that they are communists, basically. Most of them are Communist Party members or guys in the army, so just like Huiduk. But their goal, which is the same goal as Khrushchev, is to reform the system in order to save it, to make the system less self-destructive, to make the system less, harsh and like a kinder, gentler communism. They argue that Stalin, following Khrushchev, they argue that Stalin had taken the Soviet Revolution on like a U-turn, like a bad U-turn, and if we can get back on the route of Lenin, we'll be okay. And that's their goal, is to get back on the route of Lenin. I don't see Huiduk saying, let's get back on the route of Lenin. Even though, he's an he's not the most radical voice, actually. But I think it's pretty clear, given the range of things that he advocates for, that he's not calling for reforms in order to save the system. He, to me, seems to have a vision of a post-communist Vietnam. He's actually fairly careful in, he doesn't call for the end of the Communist Party, but if you add up all of the things that he wants, it would be a liberal democracy. And he's not someone who has any sort of nostalgia for Vietnamese communism as something that saved the country from imperialism or unified the country, none of that stuff. Whereas the older generations of reformists, I think they're basically communist reformists, and I think he's very much a post-communist figure. Others may disagree. I don't know what you think about that.
Okay, last question here. We're a bit over time.
Okay.
Or two more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Peter, for your great speech and analysis of Huiduk. I don't think I have a real question, but because I must say that I'm from Vietnam, and now I'm at the University of Oregon, and I must say that all of your detail is very correct and very precise, in every detail, because and your speech bring me back to the past. That all the person you mentioned in your speech is actually I also work with them, my friend or my colleague in the last almost 20 years. Only Hoàng Ngọc Hiến, I never met him. Yeah, but all other people you mentioned in your talk is I work with them and met them, and especially Huiduk for sure. Especially at the time he was at Saigon Tiếp Thị. At that time I'm also a writer for that, and we work together during that time. So yeah, thank you for your speech, very comprehensive and detailed. That brought me back to that. I just want to add from your details. I want to add some more detail about some hypothesis or theory that why Huiduk was arrested at the time. Yeah. That it seems to me that you didn't mention that when Huiduk published the books, for example, Winning Side, he also texts me at that time, because at that time the book is like a breaking things at that time, and he texts me. I think from America at that time. He's from here. Not really just a joking between friends. He said that you please tell the Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng at that time, because I'm his advisor. So he just joking between friends. Don't arrest me when I come back. Yeah. But what? I cannot do anything about that. Yeah, because it's not about my affair. I'm just an economic advisor, not security thing. Yeah, but what I know is that Nguyễn Tấn Dũng would not arrest Huiduk. Yeah, and up until now. But And people actually don't want. I don't think in Vietnamese government or authority wants to arrest Huy Đức at all. Yeah, but he's very influencing person, very influencing. Yeah, so, but the critical point from our view or our hypothesis is that because Huy Đức, in the last month, at that time, the strongman Nguyễn Phú Trọng is going to die,
Right.
and Tô Lâm is coming very quickly, and I think that Huy Đức tried to stop Tô Lâm, yeah, to get the power, and he, as you said, he's from Hà Tĩnh, his hometown. So I mean that he's in the fraction of the gang. I mean the group of Hà Tĩnh, while Tô Lâm is from the another province. So they have a big clash, and also is it alleged that Huy Đức may be supported by the military because he has a military background, while Tô Lâm in the policeman. Yeah, so something like that. So, and it's a critical time, and it's very sensitive for those who are like Tô Lâm, who is going to get the power, and Mr. Trọng is going to die. So it's very, very vulnerable time. So that's why. So that's our hypothesis. That is the reason. Otherwise, I don't think the government or the authority really want to arrest Huy Đức because it's a very big deal to just arrest him for some reason. But only at that time because it's so vulnerable for the political fighting at that time. So
Right.
just just want to add some detail.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm aware that there is this other level of analysis about his arrest related to factional politics and regional factional politics, and Huy Đức being seen as being allied with, the Hà Tĩnh group versus this other group, and the timing with the death of Chom, or the impending death of Chom and the rise of Tô Lâm is definitely a part of it. And of course, you're right, Nguyen Thanh Dung is in power when Huy Đức returns in 2013, doesn't arrest him. So even though there's evidence that he does hate him. And now Nguyen Thanh Dung is maybe coming back. He's been seen close to Tô Lâm in some reports, and I don't know if that doesn't seem like a good thing for Huy Đức. Maybe you know more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, in the summer, last summer, I come back to Vietnam and I visited Nguyễn Tấn Dũng to meet him.
Huh.
Yeah, and at that time Tô Lâm is coming, and we have a discuss about the future of the politics of Vietnam. But we can say it later. Yeah.
Huh. You should be giving this talk. Yeah.
I was just curious how Huy Đức views the United States, since he's clearly been here a number of times, and that could include his memory of the war and the United States' role in it, as well as maybe what relations the United States and Vietnam should have today, and how that compares with your typical Vietnamese person these days.
Yeah, it's a good question. And to confess, I because of whatever my professional inclinations as a Southeast Asian historian, I kind of emphasize here the local dynamics that I think help explain Huy Đức political move. But there's definitely other dynamics at play, and his experience in the U.S. I think is an interesting one. He visits twice, once on a fellowship at the University of Maryland in 2006, once in a fellowship of the Neiman Foundation in 2012. 2006, which he talked about quite a bit in the 2013 interview, he takes classes at the University of Maryland, and then he is assigned to be an intern at the Washington Times. And he shadows a Washington Times reporter who's doing a congressional beat. And he goes through Congress with this guy, and he talks about how fascinating it was to sort of, he had read about the separation of powers, but then, I don't know exactly how long it was, but he talked about this period of sort of observing it, witnessing it, he says, he describes it in a way that it clearly had a kind of impact on him. I'm loath to say Huy Đức comes to the U.S. and he becomes a reformist. And that, of course, is 2006. That's well after he first emerges on the scene in the late 80s as a reformist. But it definitely has some kind of role. It plays some kind of part. The other thing I'd mention about Huy Đức, and it's another reason why I really like him and admire him is that when something we were talking about over lunch, Vietnam is a country where Trump is hugely popular. And he's not just popular amongst conservatives. He's amongst the human rights community. He's very, very popular amongst progressive, sort of Huy Duc types. He's very popular. People who get out of prison, like Huy Duc he's not out of prison. People who get out of prison, they've been imprisoned by the party for 5 years, 6 years, whatever. They come out and they're huge Trump supporters. Huy Duc is not. Huy Duc is someone who, for whatever reason, has always been very suspicious of Trump, sort of finds distasteful about Trump the things that a lot of American liberals find distasteful about Trump that other Vietnamese liberals don't notice, I guess. I can't fully explain it, but it is something that's striking about Huy Duc, that he's part of this community. I would say, again, this is just speculating, but like 80% of these kind of reformist figures really love Trump. They think that Trump's anti-China and is going to protect Vietnam from China. They think that he's a businessman, a strong man. There's a lot of things they like about him, but Huy Duc is part of this very small minority that he adds anti-Trumpism to all the other things that I personally like about him. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm sorry, we have a little bit more time. I'm going to give you one last question that is related to your answer to that, and that is, how optimistic are you for change, and especially in the context of the rise of China in Asia? I know there are people, and it's a kind of a hope of American policy, that you see this in the newspapers a lot, that Vietnam could become an ally of America in a kind of an alliance to kind of curb China's rise. What do you think? Do you think, is Huy Duc optimistic that this changing power situation in Asia could have a positive effect, or does he have a darker view? And how about you yourself?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't speak for him, and I don't know how he views the future. But I'm not. I don't know. It's just out of my zone of expertise, predicting the future. But I've been following Vietnamese politics in an amateurish way for 30 years, and I can't say I'm optimistic. It's not. There was a moment, high Doi Moi, late 80s, early 90s, you felt like this place was going to totally transform. And then that was shut down in the early 90s. And since then, it's just been a fairly, in terms of the political sphere, it's been a fairly steady contraction of liberal spaces, I would say. And I don't see, someone smarter than me would have to explain how the new alliance between Trump and Vietnam against China is going to be good for things like civil society in Vietnam. I just don't understand how that would work. So I don't have a very sophisticated answer for you, Alec, but I would not say I'm optimistic at all.
Okay, on that note.
Yeah.